I'll give you my inheritance if you can translate this, laughed the billionaire boss, but the cleaner silenced him. Richard Warren Montgomery was having one of the worst days of his business life when he decided to take out his frustration on the first person he encountered. He had just lost a major international contract, and his anger needed a target. That's when he saw the cleaner organizing papers on his desk. Well, look what we have here, he said, picking up a yellow document he had kept hidden in his secret drawer for years. Margaret, isn't it? Since you love going through my papers so much, I have an interesting proposition for you. Margaret Johnson stopped cleaning and looked at her employer warily. In 15 years of working at that mansion in Bel Air, Los Angeles, she had learned to recognize when Richard was in one of his cruelest moods. I'll give you my entire inheritance if you can translate this document, he continued, laughing as he waved the paper in front of her face. It's in ancient Mandarin. Not even the best translators I've hired could fully decipher it. The other household staff began to gather, drawn by their boss's mocking tone. Martha, the housekeeper, smirked slyly. Robert, the chauffeur, lowered his eyes in discomfort. Everyone knew Richard loved humiliating Margaret whenever he got the chance. What do you think, Margaret? He taunted, holding out the paper. Maybe those calloused hands of yours from scrubbing floors all day have some magical power to understand ancient Chinese. Margaret looked at the document with trembling hands. The delicate letters and intricate symbols danced before her eyes like old friends she hadn't seen in years. Her heart raced, not from fear, but from a mix of nervousness and something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. May I take a look? She asked, reaching out. Of course, Richard nearly cried from laughter. Let's see what kind of translation a cleaner can manage. Martha, call everyone to witness this spectacle. Margaret took the paper carefully, as if it were a precious relic, and in a way, it was. She studied the characters for a few seconds, feeling memories of a past life wash over her like waves on a distant shore. This document, she began, her voice clear and steady, was written in the 12th year of Emperor Kangshi's reign around 1673. It's a business letter, drafted by a merchant named Li Wei. Richard's laughter slowly died in his throat. The other staff exchanged confused glances. What are you doing? He muttered. Margaret continued reading, her voice growing more confident with each word. Dear Brazilian partner, I confirm receipt of your business proposal. The spices and gold you offer are tempting, but I must warn you about the terms of our partnership. Stop that. Richard tried to snatch the paper from her hands, but Margaret stepped back, continuing the translation. Half the profits from this venture must be held in trust for my daughter, Li Mei, as agreed. She is being sent to study in Brazilian lands, and upon turning 21, she shall receive her inheritance. The businessman turned as pale as a sheet of paper. Those words were impossible. None of the professional translators had come close to such detail. How do you know this? He stammered. Margaret carefully folded the document and handed it back to him. Her eyes, which for years had seemed dulled by submission, now shone with an intensity that frightened everyone present. Because I studied Eastern languages for 20 years, Mr. Richard. I hold a PhD in linguistics from the University of California, Los Angeles, specializing in ancient and modern Mandarin. The silence that followed was deafening. Martha, the housekeeper, opened and closed her mouth like a fish out of water. Robert, the driver, widened his eyes. Francis, Richard Warren Montgomery's personal assistant, dropped the documents she was carrying. This is impossible, whispered Richard. You're a cleaner. I'm a cleaner now, corrected Margaret, keeping her voice calm. But I wasn't always. Sometimes life forces us to accept situations we never imagined for ourselves. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, take a moment to like and especially subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now, continuing. Richard looked around as if searching for an explanation for this surreal situation. His mind, accustomed to controlling everything and everyone, struggled to process what he had just witnessed. You're lying, he said, but his voice trembled. No one with a PhD would be a cleaner. Margaret took a deep breath, as if gathering the courage to tell a story she had buried long ago. My full name is Margaret Johnson Tanaka. My mother was American. My father was of Japanese descent but grew up in China. He taught me Mandarin from a young age. At 20, I won a scholarship to study linguistics at UCLA. By 30, I had my doctorate and was working as a university professor. She paused, looking at her calloused hands. At 35, I married a businessman who claimed to love me. Edward Smith, perhaps you know him. He ran an import company. Richard paled even further. Of course he knew Edward Smith. The man had been one of his main competitors until he disappeared from the market years ago. Edward used my knowledge of Eastern languages to expand his business, Margaret continued. I translated all the contracts, negotiated with Chinese suppliers, handled every international aspect of the company, until I discovered he was using our connections for illegal dealings. What kind of dealings? Asked Francis, the assistant, who had remained silent until then. Falsifying import documents, tax evasion, bribing inspectors. When I found out, I said I'd report him. That's when he showed his true face. Margaret walked to the window, gazing at the mansion's well-kept garden. Edward had recordings of our conversations where I unknowingly had given information that could be interpreted as complicity. He blackmailed me, said if I tried to expose him, he'd drag me down with him, and he made sure to ruin my academic career by spreading rumors that I was corrupt. And you accepted that? Asked Robert, the driver, who had always liked the cleaner. No. I tried to report him anyway, and he kept his promise. Not only that, but I discovered he had transferred all our assets to shell companies. I lost everything. The house, my savings, my reputation at the university. No one would hire me as a professor anymore. Richard shifted uncomfortably in his leather chair. The story was hitting nerves he'd rather leave untouched. And then, he asked, more out of curiosity than cruelty, then I found myself at 50, broke, jobless, with no references. The only thing left was to take cleaning jobs. That's how I ended up here 15 years ago. Martha, the housekeeper, who had always treated Margaret with disdain, seemed to be re-evaluating everything she thought about the woman. But why didn't you ever say anything? She asked. Margaret laughed dryly. Say what? That I was a university professor? Who would believe me? And even if they did, what good would it do? I needed work, food, a roof over my head. Pride doesn't pay rent. Richard looked again at the document in his hands. His business mind began connecting dots he'd preferred to ignore for years. This document, he said hesitantly. Where do you think I got this? I imagine you inherited it from your parents or grandparents, replied Margaret. It's probably been in your family for generations. My grandfather, he murmured. My grandfather, Anthony Montgomery. He had an import business in the 1940s and 1950s. Always said he made his fortune with business in Asia. Margaret nodded slowly. The document I just translated suggests your grandfather may have been partners with this Li Wei. If that's true, and if this Li Mei really came to the United States, what are you implying? Interrupted Richard Warren, though his voice came out sharper than he intended. I'm suggesting there may be legitimate heirs who don't know about their inheritance, said Margaret, keeping her tone neutral, and that perhaps your family's fortune has more complicated origins than you realize. The businessman abruptly stood from his chair, sending papers flying off his desk. This is speculation, theories from a cleaning lady with a PhD in linguistics, Margaret finished, with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Francis, the secretary, cleared her throat delicately. Mr. Montgomery, perhaps we should hear what Margaret has to say. I mean, Mrs. Margaret. No, he shouted. I won't allow a maid to come in here questioning the origins of my family's fortune. Dad, what's going on here? Everyone turned to see David Montgomery, Richard's son, entering the office. At 35, David had just returned from a business trip to Japan and was clearly confused by the tension in the room. Nothing that concerns you, muttered Richard. Excuse me, Mr. David, said Margaret, giving a slight bow. Your father just offered me the family inheritance in exchange for a translation. Since I managed to translate it, I was explaining the document's contents. David looked from his father to Margaret, trying to make sense of the situation. What document? Richard tried to hide the paper, but Margaret had already memorized its contents. It's a business letter from 1673, written by a Chinese merchant named Li Wei to an American partner. Likely your father's great or great-great-grandfather. You speak Chinese? Asked David, surprised. I have a PhD in linguistics with a specialization in Eastern languages, Margaret replied simply. David's eyes widened. In all the years he'd known Margaret, he'd never imagined she had academic credentials. And what does this document say? He asked. Before Richard could stop her, Margaret repeated the translation, this time with even more detail. The letter states that Li Wei would send his daughter Li Mei to study in the United States. Half the partnership's profits were to be set aside for her, to be inherited when she turned 21. What's interesting is that the letter also mentions a second document, a sort of birth and adoption certificate for Li Mei. This is ridiculous, muttered Richard, though his voice lacked conviction. Actually, Margaret continued, analyzing the handwriting and seals, I believe this Li Mei may have changed her name upon settling in the US. It was common at the time for Asian immigrants to adopt American names to ease integration. David stepped closer to Margaret, intrigued. Do you have any theory about what happened to this Li Mei? Margaret hesitated, as if deciding how much to reveal. Well, considering she would have been about 21 around 1675, and that the US received several waves of Asian immigrants at that time. Stop this, Richard exploded. Enough of these wild speculations. But David was clearly fascinated. Please go on, he urged. If Li Mei really settled in the United States and started a family, it's possible there are living descendants. People who don't even know they might be entitled to an inheritance worth millions today. The silence that followed was heavy. Everyone seemed to be processing the implications of those words. My father always told me our grandfather was a visionary businessman, said David pensively, but he never went into detail about how exactly he made his fortune. Richard Warren Montgomery was breaking into a cold sweat. His hands trembled slightly as he tucked the document into the drawer. This is just the fantasy of a desperate woman trying to stir up trouble, he said. Margaret, you're fired. I want you out of my house right now. Father, protested David, you can't fire Margaret like this. She's been here for 15 years. I can fire whoever I want. This is my house. Margaret began removing her work apron, maintaining her dignity even in the face of humiliation. Don't worry, Mr. David. I understand your father's reaction. It's hard to accept that inconvenient truths might be hidden in our own family history. Inconvenient truths? Richard repeated. What truths? Margaret carefully folded the apron and placed it on a chair. The truth that perhaps your family's fortune isn't entirely legitimate. The truth that there might be someone out there with a legal claim to half of all this. She gestured to the lavish office, with its fine wooden furniture and expensive artwork. And the truth that for 15 years you've belittled and mistreated a woman who, under different circumstances, could have been your equal, or even your academic superior. Richard turned purple with rage. How dare you speak to me like that? Get out before I call security. That won't be necessary, said Margaret, walking toward the door. But I'll leave you with one last piece of information. All these years cleaning this house, I've overheard many phone calls. Calls about business, about offshore accounts, about documents that perhaps shouldn't exist. Richard froze. What are you implying? Margaret turned one last time before leaving. I'm saying that an invisible housekeeper sees and hears many things that important people would rather forget ever happened. And with that, she walked out of the office, leaving behind a tense silence. David looked at his father, who was clearly shaken. Father, what did she mean about the phone calls? Nothing, muttered Richard. Just the desperation of a fired woman trying to scare us. But even as he said it, he knew it wasn't true. Margaret was right. For years, he had made confidential calls in her presence, treating her like part of the furniture. How many secrets had she involuntarily absorbed? Frances, the secretary, cleared her throat nervously. Mr. Richard, may I suggest something? What? Perhaps we should investigate the authenticity of this document. If there really are legitimate heirs, there are no heirs, he snapped, and I won't allow a resentful housekeeper to destroy my family's reputation. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us newcomers a lot. Now continuing. 3 days later, Richard still couldn't get the conversation with Margaret out of his head. He had spent nights sifting through old family papers, searching for clues about his grandfather's business dealings. What he found only deepened his anxiety. Import documents from the 1940s and 1950s showed suspicious transactions, large sums of money moved without clear explanation. And most disturbing of all, multiple references to Asian partners who were never properly identified. On the morning of the 4th day, he received an unexpected call. "Mr. Montgomery, this is Margaret. I need to speak with you." Richard Warren nearly dropped the phone. "Margaret, how did you get my private number?" "Sir, I worked in your home for 15 years. I know all your phone numbers by heart." He sighed, realizing how true and unsettling that remark was. "What do you want?" "I want to talk about the document I translated. I've discovered some things you need to know. I'm not interested in your conspiracy theories." "They're not theories, Mr. Richard Warren. I found Lee May." The businessman almost dropped the phone again. "What did you say?" "I found Lee May's descendant. She's alive, 78 years old, and lives in Chinatown right here in Los Angeles." Richard Warren felt the world spin around him. "That's impossible. I can prove it. If you'd like, we can meet this afternoon. I'll bring all the documents I've gathered." "Why are you doing this?" he asked, suspicious. "What do you want in return?" Margaret was silent for a few seconds before answering. "I want justice, Mr. Richard Warren. For her, for me, and even for you. Justice for me. You have no idea the weight you carry on your shoulders, what this hidden truth is doing to your conscience, even if you won't admit it. Have you noticed how poorly you've been sleeping lately?" It was true, Richard Warren hadn't had a peaceful night's sleep in years. He'd always blamed it on business stress, but now he wondered if there was something deeper. "Where do you want to meet?" he asked, against his better judgment. "At the downtown public library, at 3 o'clock. And Mr. Richard Warren, bring the original document." The line went dead. Margaret had hung up. Richard Warren spent the rest of the morning in a state of extreme anxiety. Part of him wanted to ignore the meeting, pretend none of this was happening, but another part, one he'd tried to suppress for years, was curious to know the truth. At exactly 3 in the afternoon, he entered the public library. The austere, silent atmosphere made him even more nervous. Margaret was seated at a table in the back, surrounded by books and documents. "Mr. Richard Warren," she greeted, standing up. "Thank you for coming." He sat across from her, noticing Margaret had swapped her cleaning uniform for simple yet elegant clothes. Without the apron and with her hair down, she looked like a completely different person. "Show me what you found," he said, getting straight to the point. Margaret opened a folder and pulled out several old photographs. "This is Lee May," she said, showing a black and white photo of a young Asian woman, or rather, Mary Lee Santos, as she came to be known when she settled in the United States in 1674. Richard Warren took the photo with trembling hands. The young woman had delicate features and wore clothing typical of the era. "How did you get this?" "Immigration records, Catholic Church archives, naturalization documents." Mary Lee married a Portuguese man named John Santos, and they had 4 children. She stayed in touch with China through letters for many years, always hoping to receive the inheritance she was owed. Margaret showed other photos, birth and marriage certificates. "But she never received anything?" asked Richard Warren. "No. From what I've uncovered, your grandfather, Anthony Montgomery, was indeed Lee Wei's business partner, but when Lee Wei passed away in 1680, Anthony simply never passed on the inheritance to Mary Lee. She tried to claim her rights through lawyers, but couldn't prove the partnership. And then? Mary Lee spent the rest of her life in poverty, working as a seamstress to support her children. She died in 1720 at 66, still waiting for the justice that never came. Richard Warren Montgomery silently observed the photos, feeling a growing weight in his chest. What about her descendants? "Here's the interesting part," said Margaret, pulling more documents from the folder. Mary Lee had 4 children, who in turn had many grandchildren and great-grandchildren. One lineage thrived, another moved inland, and 2 practically vanished from the records. But you said you found someone. Yes, Mrs. Kimiko Santos is 78 years old and is Mary Lee's great-great-granddaughter. She knows the family history, but was never aware of the details about the lost inheritance. Margaret showed a recent photo of an elderly Asian woman with white hair, smiling gently at the camera. She lives alone in a small apartment in Chinatown. She worked her whole life as a teacher of origami and ikebana. Never married, she dedicated her life to preserving the traditions Mary Lee brought from China. Richard felt sick. That elderly woman living modestly was the rightful heir to half his fortune. "What does she want?" he asked. "We haven't discussed the inheritance yet. First, I wanted to make sure you'd be willing to do the right thing." "And what would the right thing be, in your opinion?" Margaret leaned across the table, looking him straight in the eye. "Acknowledge her rights. Return what is legally hers. And maybe in the process find some peace of mind." Richard laughed humorlessly. "You want me to hand over half of everything I own to a stranger, based on documents from 300 years ago?" "Not a stranger. The rightful heir to a business partnership established by your own grandfather. Even if that were true, there are no legal obligations after so much time." "Perhaps not legal," Margaret agreed. "But moral? Ethical? Those obligations don't expire, Mr. Montgomery." He put the photos back in the folder, struggling to keep his composure. "And if I say no? If I just ignore all this?" Margaret sighed sadly. "Then you'll carry this weight for the rest of your life. And I'll do what I believe is right. I'll tell Mrs. L. Kimiko everything and help her seek justice through whatever means we have." "Is this blackmail?" "No, Mr. Montgomery. It's conscience. Something your family lost long ago but can still reclaim." Richard stood abruptly, knocking over his chair. "I need to think." "Of course, but don't take too long. Mrs. Kimiko is 78. She deserves to spend her final years knowing her family has finally received the recognition it deserves." Richard left the library in a state of extreme agitation. He drove aimlessly through the streets of Los Angeles, his mind racing in circles. Everything Margaret had uncovered made sense. The documents seemed authentic, the genealogy was well-founded, and deep down, he had always known there was something suspicious about the family fortune. When he finally arrived home, he found David waiting for him in the study. "Dad, we need to talk." "I'm not in the mood for conversation, David." "It's about Margaret and that document," Richard froze. "What about it?" "I hired a private investigator to check her story. Everything she said is true. Margaret Johnson Tanaka really was a university professor. She really was married to Edward Smith, and she really lost everything when she tried to expose her husband's illegal activities." "Why did you do that?" David stepped closer, his expression serious. "Because I needed to know if we could trust her, and now I know we can. Dad, if she's right about this document, about this inheritance—" "There is no inheritance!" Richard shouted. "This is all the invention of a bitter woman." "Dad, stop. I saw how you reacted when she translated that document. I saw the fear in your eyes. You know she's right." Richard Warren Montgomery sank into the armchair, suddenly looking much older than his 65 years. "What if she's right?" he murmured. "What does that mean for us?" "It means we have a chance to do the right thing," said David, sitting across from his father. "For the first time in our family, we can choose honor over profit. Are you willing to give up half of our inheritance?" David was silent for a long moment. "Dad, these past few years, I've been wondering why our family can never truly be happy. Why, even with all this wealth, we always feel like something's missing. And you think it's because of a historical debt? I think it's because of a moral debt that was never paid, one that's been eating away at our souls for generations." Richard Warren looked at his son with a mix of pride and sadness. "When did you get so wise?" "When I started paying attention to the people we mistreated, like Margaret. Dad, I grew up watching you humiliate that woman every day, and she took it all in silence, working with dignity despite all the disrespect. And now we find out she's more educated and qualified than any of us," Richard Warren added bitterly. "And we find out she spent 15 years listening to our secrets, our plans, our weaknesses. Even after being fired so shamefully, She never used that information against us. Richard Warren thought of all the phone calls he'd made in Margaret's presence. Shady deals, offshore accounts, tax evasion schemes. She could have destroyed him at any moment. "Why didn't she do anything?" he asked. "Because she has integrity, Dad, something our family lost along the way." That night, Richard Warren couldn't sleep. He stayed in his home library, sifting through old family documents. What he found confirmed his worst fears. His grandfather Anthony had indeed misappropriated a fortune that wasn't entirely his. There were letters, contracts, receipts, all pointing to Lee Wei's trust being betrayed. And the worst of it, a letter from Mary Lee, written in Portuguese and dated 1695, pleading for justice. "Mr. Anthony, I know you are a good man. My father spoke highly of you, of the friendship you shared. I know you have children, just as I do. I only ask for what my father left for me. I don't want to take anything from you, just what is rightfully mine." The letter was yellowed and fragile, but the words leapt off the page like vivid accusations. Richard Warren imagined the desperate young woman trying to raise 4 children alone while the wealth that should have been partly hers built the Montgomery empire. By morning, he'd made his decision. He called Margaret. "I want to meet Mrs. Kimiko," he said without preamble. "Are you sure?" "No, I'm not sure of anything. But I need to look her in the eye. I can arrange a meeting for this afternoon, at her home." "All right. And Margaret?" "Yes?" "Thank you. For your patience, your dignity, and for making me face the truth." Mrs. Kimiko's apartment was small but cozy, carefully decorated and filled with antique Asian pieces. The elderly woman greeted Richard Warren with a courtesy that made him feel even worse. "Mr. Richard Warren," she said with a respectful bow, "Margaret has told me about you. It's an honor to have you in my home." Richard Warren glanced around the modest apartment and felt choked by guilt. This kind woman should have been living in luxury, not in this cramped space. "Mrs. Kimiko, he began, but the words wouldn't come. "Please, sit," she said, gesturing to a floor cushion. "I'll prepare tea." While Mrs. Kimiko busied herself in the kitchen, Margaret showed Richard Warren the objects scattered around the living room. Each one had a story, a connection to Mary Lee and her Chinese heritage. "She kept everything," Margaret murmured. "All the traditions, all the memories, as if she were preserving the identity of an entire family." Mrs. Kimiko returned with tea and sat across from Richard. Her eyes sparkled with curiosity and kindness. "Margaret told me you have documents about my family," she said. "I always knew there was an untold story about our origins, but I could never uncover the details." Richard pulled the ancient Mandarin document from his briefcase. "This paper belonged to your ancestor Lee Wei. It establishes a business partnership with my grandfather." Mrs. Kimiko took the document with reverence, as if touching a sacred relic. "Lee Wei," she sighed. "My great-great-grandmother Mary Lee always spoke of him. She said he was an honorable man who built bridges between 2 worlds." "She also spoke of an inheritance she never received," Margaret added gently. Mrs. Kimiko nodded sadly. "Yes. She said our great-grandfather had left something for her in the United States, but she could never claim it. She died believing our family was entitled to more than the poverty we lived in." Richard felt as if he'd been punched in the gut. He looked at the elderly woman, who had spent her entire life preserving the memory of injustices she didn't even know existed. "Mrs. Kimiko," he said, struggling to keep his voice steady, "what would you say if I told you your family does have a rightful claim to an inheritance, a substantial one?" The woman's eyes widened. "What do you mean?" Margaret leaned forward. "Mrs. Kimiko, Mr. Richard Warren is descended from Lee Wei's American business partner, and the documents prove that half of the family's original fortune should have been yours." Mrs. Kimiko fell silent for a long moment, processing the information. "And what does that mean today?" she finally asked. Richard took a deep breath. "It means you have a legal and moral right to half of everything my family owns. The house, the businesses, the bank accounts, everything." "That's millions of dollars," Margaret added. Mrs. Kimiko set her teacup down with trembling hands. I don't know what to say. You don't have to say anything right now, Richard said. But you should know that no matter what you decide, my family acknowledges the debt we owe yours. Debt? A 300-year debt. A debt of honor, of justice, of reparation for generations of injustice. Mrs. Kimiko stood and walked to the window, watching the street below. All my life, she said, I felt like I carried the weight of a sadness that wasn't entirely my own, as if I'd inherited an ancestral grief. She turned to face them. Now I understand where that feeling came from. And what do you want to do with this information? Richard asked. Mrs. Kimiko sat back down, her eyes shining with a determination that surprised them all. I want justice. Not for me, I've lived my life, but for Mary Lee, who died waiting, for all the generations of my family who struggled while the wealth that belonged to them funded others' luxury. You want to sue my family? Richard asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. No, she replied, surprising them. I want partnership. How so? Mrs. Kimiko smiled for the first time since the conversation had begun. Li Wei and your grandfather were partners, not enemies. Maybe it's time we honored the original spirit of that partnership. Margaret and Richard exchanged glances, intrigued. What do you have in mind? Margaret asked. A foundation, said Mrs. Kimiko with growing conviction. An organization that uses this recovered wealth to help people like us. People who have lost everything due to injustices, who need a second chance. Richard Warren Montgomery felt something stir deep in his chest. A sensation he hadn't experienced in years. Hope. A foundation for what, specifically? To help women like Margaret, said Mrs. Kimiko, looking affectionately at the former cleaning lady. Educated women who lost everything due to circumstances beyond their control. To provide scholarships for underprivileged youth. To preserve the culture and traditions that connect the United States to Asia. And to right historical wrongs, added Margaret, understanding Mrs. Kimiko's vision. Richard found himself imagining the possibilities, using his family's wealth for something genuinely good for the first time in generations. So this would mean I keep half the inheritance, but use a significant portion of it constructively, he asked. Exactly, confirmed Mrs. Kimiko. And it would mean Li Wei and Anthony Montgomery would finally be working together, as it always should have been. Dear listener, if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel. It helps us a lot as we're just starting out. Now back to the story. Richard felt unexpected tears welling in his eyes. For the first time in his adult life, he glimpsed a path that could bring real meaning to his existence. I'd like to propose something additional, he said. I want Margaret to be the executive director of this foundation. Margaret nearly dropped her teacup. Mr. Richard, no, let me finish. For 15 years, I treated you as if you were invisible. I took advantage of your need, your vulnerability. It's time to recognize not just your qualifications, but also your wisdom and integrity. But I have no experience running a foundation. You have something better, Mrs. Kimiko interjected. You have genuine empathy for those who suffer injustice. And you have the intelligence to find solutions. Richard nodded firmly. Besides, you understand better than any of us what it means to live with dignity even in the hardest circumstances. Margaret looked from one to the other, struggling to process the proposal. This would completely change my life. And ours too, said Richard. We'd finally give real purpose to the Montgomery family wealth. Mrs. Kimiko stood and walked to a small shelf, retrieving an old wooden box. I've kept this my whole life, she said, opening it, hoping one day its meaning would be understood. Inside was a small jade pendant, engraved with Chinese symbols. It belonged to Mary Lee, the only thing of value she managed to keep from China. Margaret examined the pendant, translating the symbols. Justice and partnership, she read. May the children correct the mistakes of their parents. The silence that followed was heavy with emotion. Three people from completely different backgrounds and paths, united by a thread of historical injustice that could finally be severed. So, are we all in agreement? Richard asked. Yes, replied Mrs. Kimiko, but on one condition. What? I want my share of the inheritance to go entirely to the foundation. I don't need millions to live out my remaining years. I need to know my family's memory will be honored through real action. Richard felt deep admiration for this woman. Even with every legal and moral right to claim the wealth for herself, she chose to use it for the greater good. "And I want to donate 80% of my share as well," he said. 20% will be more than enough for David and me to live comfortably." Margaret shook her head, impressed. "Are you all certain about this?" "Absolutely," Richard Warren Montgomery and Mrs. Kimiko replied in unison. "Then I accept the role as the Foundation's director," Margaret said, her voice trembling with emotion. "But I want it to bear the name Mary Lee Santos, so her story is never forgotten." "The Mary Lee Santos Foundation," Mrs. Kimiko repeated, smiling through her tears. "She would be proud." Richard stood and extended his hand to Margaret. "Partners?" he asked. "Partners," she replied, shaking his hand firmly. The three spent the rest of the afternoon planning the Foundation's first steps. Every idea that emerged seemed to weave together threads of their personal experiences. Job placement programs for those who had lost everything, scholarships for women over 40 wanting to return to school, cultural centers preserving Asian traditions in the United States. When Richard finally prepared to leave, Mrs. Kimiko walked him to the door. "Mr. Montgomery," she said, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "How do you feel now, knowing the truth about your heritage?" Richard paused in thought. "I feel free," he answered, surprised by his own words. "For the first time in years, I truly feel free." "That's what I hoped to hear," Mrs. Kimiko said with a smile. "The truth always sets you free, even when it's painful." A week later, Richard called an extraordinary family meeting. David was there, along with his wife Melissa and their 2 teenage children. The news of the uncovered inheritance and the decision to create the foundation sparked mixed reactions. "Dad, are you sure about this?" Melissa asked. "We're talking about a fortune." "We're talking about doing what's right," Richard replied. "But why now? Why after all these years?" David answered for his father. "Because sometimes it takes a lifetime to find the courage to face our own ghosts." Richard's grandchildren, 16-year-old George and 15-year-old Lily, asked insightful questions about the foundation and showed enthusiasm for the project. It was as if the younger generation instinctively understood the moral weight of the decision. "Grandpa," Lily said, "can I help with the foundation? I'm working on a school project about Asian immigration in the US." "Of course you can," Richard replied, feeling genuine pride in his grandchildren for the first time. "In fact, I want the whole family involved. It's time for the Montgomerys to leave a positive legacy in the world." News of the Mary Lee Santos Foundation spread quickly through Los Angeles' social circles. Reactions varied. Some applauded the initiative, others questioned Richard's sanity, but he found he no longer cared about others' opinions. Margaret threw herself into the project with the same passion she had once devoted to her academic career decades earlier. Within months, the foundation was already launching its first support programs. The first beneficiary was Robert, the former driver for the Montgomery family, who had lost his job when Richard downsized the mansion's staff. At 55, Robert thought starting over was impossible. The foundation not only helped him find new work, but also funded a mechanics course he'd always wanted to take. "Mrs. Johnson," Robert said on his graduation day, "you've changed my life." "No, Robert," she replied. "You changed your own life. We just gave you the tools." The second beneficiary was Martha, the former housekeeper who had been let go along with other staff. Initially resentful toward Margaret, she gradually came to see the foundation as a real chance for a fresh start. At 58 years old, Martha used the foundation's support to open a small business selling eco-friendly cleaning products. "Who would have thought," she remarked to Margaret during a visit to the foundation, "the woman I treated poorly ended up being my salvation." "It was never about personal treatment," Margaret replied. "It was about recognizing that everyone deserves dignity and opportunities." A year after the foundation's creation, Richard Warren Montgomery received an unexpected call. It was from Edward Smith, Margaret's ex-husband. "Richard Warren, I heard about your foundation and Margaret as its director." "And what do you want, Edward?" Richard asked, caution in his voice. I want to apologize. To her, to you, to everyone I've hurt over the years. A little late for regrets, don't you think? Maybe. But it's never too late to try to make amends. Edward explained that he had spent the last few years reflecting on his actions and wanted to contribute to the foundation. He had sold some assets and wished to donate the money to their support programs. Why should I trust you? Richard asked. Because Margaret taught me that redemption is possible, even for people like us. Richard agreed to pass along Margaret's contact, but made it clear the decision would be entirely hers. When Margaret learned about the call, she fell silent for several minutes. Has he really changed? She asked Richard. I don't know, but you always told me everyone deserves a second chance. Margaret decided to meet Edward, but on neutral ground, at the Foundation's office with Richard present. The meeting was tense at first, but gradually turned into a conversation about forgiveness and second chances. Margaret, I don't expect you to forgive me, Edward said. I just want to contribute to the good you're doing. Forgiveness isn't about you, Edward, she replied. It's about me, about freeing myself from the weight of resentment. Edward's donation allowed the Foundation to expand its programs, including psychological support for people who had lost everything due to betrayal or injustice. 2 years after its creation, the Mary Lee Santos Foundation had become a reference in Los Angeles. Hundreds had benefited, from women who resumed abandoned careers to young people who secured full scholarships. Mrs. Kimiko, despite her advanced age, actively participated in the Foundation's activities. She created a cultural preservation program that taught Eastern languages and Asian traditions to young Asian Americans who had lost touch with their roots. It's incredible, she told Margaret during a graduation ceremony. I see in these young people the same determination Mary Lee must have had when she arrived in the United States. And the same resilience, Margaret added, the ability to honor the past while building the future. Richard had completely transformed. The arrogant, cruel man who once humiliated employees had given way to someone humble and generous. He devoted most of his time to the Foundation, discovering that helping others was infinitely more rewarding than accumulating wealth. Dad is unrecognizable, David remarked to Melissa one evening. It's like he found his true self after years of wearing a mask. People can change when they find real purpose in life, Melissa replied. Your family finally found yours. David had taken over the family's remaining businesses, implementing ethical practices and social responsibility across all companies. Profits shrank, but personal fulfillment grew exponentially. On the Foundation's 3rd anniversary, Margaret organized a special event. All beneficiaries were invited, along with donors and volunteers. The hall was filled with stories of resilience and new beginnings. Richard Warren Montgomery was invited to speak, but when he took the stage, he was too emotional to deliver the prepared speech. 3 years ago, he said, his voice breaking, I was a wealthy and miserable man. I had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. A courageous woman showed me there's something more valuable than wealth. Redemption. He looked at Margaret in the audience. Margaret, you didn't just translate an ancient document. You translated my soul from a language of selfishness to one of compassion. The crowd applauded enthusiastically, but Margaret stood and walked to the stage. May I speak too? She asked. Richard handed her the microphone. 3 years ago, I was a broken, humiliated woman who had lost faith in justice, Margaret said. Today, I lead an organization that proves daily that justice is possible, even when it seems impossible. She glanced at Mrs. Kimiko in the front row. Mrs. Kimiko taught me that some seeds take generations to sprout, but when they finally bloom, they nourish countless other plants. And Richard taught me it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and try to make them right. The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. After the event, Margaret, Richard, and Mrs. Kimiko sat in the Foundation's garden, reflecting on their shared journey. Sometimes I wonder, Richard said, what my life would have been like if I'd never mocked you that day, Margaret. You'd probably still be a wealthy, unhappy man, she replied, and I'd still be an invisible cleaner. And I'd still be a lonely old woman guarding family secrets, added Mrs. Kimiko. Then perhaps everything happened exactly as it should have, Richard said. Or maybe, Margaret suggested, this is just the universe's way of correcting very old injustices. Mrs. Kimiko smiled and touched the jade pendant she now always wore. Mary Lee would be proud, she murmured. Her story finally got the ending it deserved. 5 years after the Foundation's creation, Margaret received an unexpected invitation. UCLA wanted to honor her with an emeritus professorship, recognizing her contributions to linguistics and society. "I'll accept," she told Richard, "but on one condition." "What?" "I want you to be honored too, for your work in social justice." "Margaret, I don't deserve—" "Yes, you do. Not everyone has the courage to admit they were wrong and completely change their life." The ceremony at UCLA was moving. Margaret took the stage to receive her honor, wearing the same blue suit she'd worn as a cleaner, now a symbol of her journey of resilience. In her speech, she dedicated the recognition to all women who had lost everything but found strength to begin again. "Education isn't just about degrees or titles," she said. "It's about learning from our experiences, turning pain into wisdom, and using that wisdom to help others." Richard was also honored for his 5 years of philanthropic work. In his speech, he was direct. "5 years ago, I humiliated a woman by offering my inheritance for a translation. Today, I understand she didn't just accept my challenge, she gave me a far greater inheritance. The inheritance of redemption." After the ceremony, the three partners, Margaret, Richard, and Mrs. Kimiko, walked through the university campus where Margaret had studied decades earlier. "You know what amazes me most about this whole story?" Richard said. "What?" the two women asked. "How one decision can change not just a life, but entire generations." "Lee Wei and Anthony Montgomery made a decision 300 years ago," remarked Mrs. Kimiko. "We simply corrected the consequences of that decision." "And future generations will reap the benefits of our correction," added Margaret. "A cycle of justice instead of a cycle of injustice," agreed Richard Warren Montgomery. 10 years after the organization's founding, the Mary Lee Santos Foundation had become a respected international institution. It had offices in other U.S. cities and exchange programs with similar organizations in China and Japan. Margaret, now 65, remained the executive director, but had established a structure allowing the foundation to continue operating even after her eventual retirement. Richard, at 75, spent most of his time as a volunteer at the foundation, finding more fulfillment in helping others than he had in decades of corporate life. Mrs. Kimiko, despite being 88, still actively participated in the foundation's cultural programs, always accompanied by some of the young people who had benefited from her lessons on Eastern traditions. On a quiet afternoon, the three were seated in Margaret's office when David arrived with surprising news. "You won't believe what I found," he said, clearly excited. "What is it?" asked Margaret. "I've been researching more about Lee Wei's family history, following some leads in Macau's historical archives." He placed a folder on the table. "I found records of other U.S. partners of Lee Wei. Apparently, he had business partnerships with at least 3 different families in the United States." Mrs. Kimiko leaned over the documents. "It means there could be other U.S. families who built their fortunes on similar partnerships," David finished, "and possibly other descendants of Chinese heritage who never received their inheritance." Margaret examined the documents with the eye of an experienced linguist. "These names, Smith, Santos, Green, they're very common surnames in the U.S. It would be nearly impossible to track all the descendants." "But not impossible," said Richard, a familiar gleam in his eyes. "Not if we have the right methodology and enough resources." "Dad, what are you thinking?" asked David. "I'm thinking our mission might be much bigger than we imagined," Richard replied. "Perhaps the Mary Lee Santos Foundation should expand its scope to include investigating and repairing other similar historical injustices." Mrs. Kimiko clapped her hands softly. "Lee Wei would be proud. He always believed one good deed should inspire many others." Margaret considered the proposal. It would be an ambitious project. It would require enormous resources, a specialized team, and time, added Richard. Likely decades of work. "But imagine the impact," said David. "How many families could finally learn their true origins? How many historical wrongs could be set right? Margaret looked out the window, watching the young students attending the Foundation's programs. It would create a legacy lasting generations, she murmured. Exactly as Mary Lee would have wanted, agreed Mrs. Kimiko. Richard stood and walked to a framed photo on the wall, showing the Foundation's inauguration ceremony. 10 years ago, a humiliated janitor taught me that the truth always finds a way to surface. Maybe it's our responsibility to help other truths surface too. So, are we decided? Asked Margaret. Wait, said Mrs. Kimiko, raising a frail hand. There's something you need to know before making this decision. Everyone looked at her curiously. In recent months, I've been receiving letters from people who learned about our story through the press. Descendants of Chinese, Japanese, and Koreans who came to the United States at different times. She opened a drawer and pulled out a stack of letters. Many of them have stories similar to ours. Lost inheritances, forgotten documents, families erased from official history. Margaret picked up a few of the letters and began reading them. My God, she murmured. There are dozens of them. 53 to be exact, said Mrs. Kimiko. And more arrive every week. Richard Warren Montgomery sat down heavily, processing the magnitude of what they were uncovering. This means our situation wasn't an isolated case. It was part of a systematic pattern of injustices against Asian immigrants in the United States. And that we have a moral responsibility to investigate each of these stories, added Margaret. David flipped through some of the letters. Some of these families still live in poverty, even though they're descendants of successful merchants and business owners. While other families, like ours, built empires based on partnerships that were never properly honored, said Richard Warren. Mrs. Kimiko stood and walked to the window. Do you know the irony in all this? She said. What? The others asked. Li Wei always said true wealth wasn't in the money accumulated, but in the human connections built through trust and mutual respect. She turned to face them. Perhaps our mission isn't just to repair financial injustices, but to restore those human connections that were broken generations ago. Margaret felt a shiver down her spine. Mrs. Kimiko's observation had touched something profound. Are you suggesting we create not just a financial reparations program, but a network for cultural and family reconnection? Exactly, replied Mrs. Kimiko. Imagine how many Asian American families lost touch with their roots because of these historical injustices. How many traditions were abandoned, how many languages forgotten, how many identities suppressed. Richard Warren began to understand Mrs. Kimiko's vision. So we'd be healing not just financial wounds, but cultural and spiritual ones. And building bridges between the United States and Asia that should have existed centuries ago, added David. Margaret stood, feeling a familiar energy coursing through her veins. It was the same sensation she'd experienced as a university professor when uncovering a new linguistic or cultural connection. This would be revolutionary, she said, not just for the families involved, but for understanding the history of Asian immigration in the United States. And it would truly fulfill Li Wei and Mary Lee's legacy, agreed Mrs. Kimiko. Richard Warren looked around the room, seeing not just the present, but envisioning a future where hundreds of families could rediscover their true identities and heritage. Then it's decided, he said. The Mary Lee Santos Foundation will expand its mission to become a center for investigation, reparations, and reconnection for Asian American families. With one condition, said Margaret. What? I want us to create an advisory board made up of descendants from different Asian countries. Chinese, Japanese, Korean, Thai, Vietnamese, all the Asian diversity that contributed to shaping the United States. An excellent idea, approved Mrs. Kimiko. Li Wei always believed strength came from uniting different perspectives. David smiled. My grandfather Anthony is probably rolling in his grave, seeing his ill-gotten fortune being used to reconnect the United States with Asia in a fair and honest way. Or maybe he's finally finding peace, suggested Margaret, knowing his family has finally corrected his mistakes. 2 years later, the Mary Lee Santos Foundation had become the largest Asian American reconnection organization in the country. They had offices in Los Angeles, New York, Chicago, and Miami, each specializing in the different waves of Asian immigration to their respective regions. The genealogical research program had located over 200 families with claims to lost or suppressed inheritances. Not all reparations were financial. Many American families voluntarily contributed by donating family artifacts or opening historical archives to aid the research. Margaret had become a respected public figure, often invited to speak on historical justice and cultural reconciliation. But she always insisted the real credit belonged to people like Mrs. Kimiko and, surprisingly, to Richard Warren Montgomery. Richard had the courage to admit his fortune had questionable origins, she would say in her talks. How many of us would have that moral courage? Richard, for his part, had discovered a late passion for history. At 77, he was pursuing an undergraduate degree in history at UCLA, specializing in the American colonial period and trade relations with Asia. "I'm trying to understand how my grandfather went from business partner to usurper," he explained to Margaret during one of their study sessions. "I believe understanding the historical context can help us prevent similar situations from repeating." Mrs. Kimiko, despite being 90, remained the heart of the foundation. Her wisdom and historical perspective were consulted in all major decisions. She had become a kind of matriarch to hundreds of families who had rediscovered their roots through the foundation's work. "True wealth," she often said, "isn't in what we possess, but in what we manage to give back to the world." One spring morning, Margaret received a call that would once again change the course of the foundation. "Mrs. Margaret, this is Professor Zhang Wei from Peking University." Margaret straightened in her chair. She knew Professor Zhang's reputation as one of the foremost experts on Chinese commercial history. "Professor Zhang, it's an honor to speak with you." "The pleasure is mine, Mrs. Margaret. I've been following the work of the Mary Lee Santos Foundation, and I'm impressed by the results." "Thank you, Professor. Actually, I'm calling to propose a partnership. The Chinese government is creating a program to reconnect Chinese communities scattered around the world with their origins. The United States would be one of the priority countries." Margaret's heart raced. "What kind of partnership?" "Researcher exchanges, access to Chinese historical archives, study programs in China for Chinese American descendants, and most importantly, official recognition by the Chinese government of the historical injustices suffered by families like Li Wei's." "That would be extraordinary. And there's more. If the foundation accepts the partnership, the Chinese government is willing to establish a historical reparations fund specifically for Chinese American descendants." Margaret had to sit down. The magnitude of the proposal was staggering. "Professor Zhang, may I discuss this with my partners and get back to you?" "Of course, but I'd like to visit in person to present the full proposal. Would next week work?" "Absolutely." After hanging up, Margaret immediately called Richard and Mrs. Kimiko. Within an hour, the three were gathered in the foundation's office. "This is unbelievable," Richard said after hearing the proposal. "The Chinese government wants to officially support us." "It's more than support," Margaret corrected. "It's acknowledgement. Acknowledgement that the injustices we suffered weren't isolated incidents, but part of a historical pattern that deserves redress." Mrs. Kimiko was silent, but her eyes shone with an emotion Margaret couldn't quite place. "Mrs. Kimiko, what are you thinking?" The elderly woman took a deep breath. "I'm thinking that Mary Lee has finally made it home." "What do you mean?" "All her life she held on to the hope that one day China would recognize her as a rightful daughter who had been sent to distant lands. It never happened in her lifetime." Mrs. Kimiko touched the jade pendant around her neck. "But now, 350 years later, through our foundation, she will finally receive that recognition." Richard Warren Montgomery leaned forward. "Do you think we should accept the partnership?" "I don't believe we have a choice," Mrs. Kimiko replied. "Li Wei sent Mary Lee to the United States to build bridges between two worlds. Our mission is to finish building that bridge." A week later, Professor Zhang Wei arrived in Los Angeles, accompanied by an official Chinese delegation. The meeting took place in the main hall of the foundation, with representatives from the Asian American community across the city in attendance. The People's Republic of China, officially acknowledges that Chinese American families have suffered historical injustices resulting in the loss of heritage, cultural identity, and family connections, Professor Zhang declared in his formal address. As part of our Global Reconnection program, we are offering the Mary Lee Santos Foundation a partnership that will include financial resources, access to historical archives, exchange programs, and diplomatic recognition. The audience applauded enthusiastically, but Margaret noticed Richard seemed troubled. "Professor Zhang," Margaret said, "would this partnership create any kind of political obligation for the foundation?" "Absolutely not," the professor replied. "The foundation would retain complete independence. Our only requirement is transparency in resource allocation and annual progress reports on the programs." "What about the legal aspect?" asked David, who had joined the meeting. "Would this partnership affect the legal status of reparations in the United States?" Professor Zhang smiled. "In fact, the Chinese government is prepared to send an official diplomatic note to the US government, recommending that the United States facilitate genealogical research and historical reparations for Chinese American descendants." Richard stood up. "Professor Zhang, may I ask a direct question?" "Of course." "Why is China doing this now? What is the Chinese government's real interest?" The professor appreciated the frankness of the question. "Mr. Montgomery, modern China understands that its strength comes not just from economic power, but from its human connections around the world. Thriving Chinese American communities, reconnected with their roots, are natural ambassadors of Chinese culture in the United States. But it's more than that," he added. "It's a matter of historical justice. For centuries, China was exploited by foreign powers. Now that we have resources and influence, we have a moral responsibility to right injustices, even those we did not directly cause." Mrs. Kimiko rose slowly, leaning on her cane. "Professor Zhang, may I tell a story?" "Please." "My great-great-grandmother Mary Lee used to say that one day China would be a great nation again, and when that day came, it would not forget its children scattered across the world." Mrs. Kimiko's voice trembled with emotion. She was right. China has not forgotten. And today, through you and your delegation, Mary Lee has finally come home. The silence that followed was deep and reverent. Many in the audience were in tears, including some members of the Chinese delegation. "Mrs. Kimiko," said Professor Zhang, clearly moved, "it would be an honor if you accepted the role of honorary ambassador for this partnership between China and the Mary Lee Santos Foundation." "I accept," she replied without hesitation, "in the name of Mary Lee, of Li Wei, and of all the Chinese American families who never lost hope." The partnership signing ceremony took place 3 months later at an event that brought together American and Chinese officials, representatives of the Asian American community, and hundreds of beneficiaries of the foundation. Margaret, as executive director, signed the documents alongside Professor Zhang and a representative from the US Department of State. "This document," she said during her speech, "represents more than a partnership between organizations. It represents the healing of historical wounds that once seemed incurable." Richard Warren Montgomery was also invited to speak. Now 80 years old with completely white hair, he took the stage with the dignity of a man who had found true purpose in life. 15 years ago, he said, "I was a man who believed power came from humiliating others. Today, I understand that true power comes from the ability to lift others up." He looked at Margaret in the audience. "Margaret Johnson Tanaka taught me that the most important translation we can make in life isn't between languages, but from injustice to justice, from hatred to love, from separation to connection." The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted 5 minutes. After the ceremony, Margaret, Richard, and Mrs. Kimiko met in the foundation's garden for a private moment of reflection. "We did it," Margaret murmured. "We really did it." "What?" Richard asked. "We turned humiliation into a revolution, a moment of cruelty into a movement for justice." Mrs. Kimiko smiled, touching the jade pendant that now held new meaning. "Li Wei always said the best seeds are the ones that seem dead the longest. When they finally sprout, they grow into the strongest trees." "And we planted an entire forest," Richard said. "No," Margaret corrected. "We only watered a seed that was planted 300 years ago. Mary Lee planted that seed with her dignity, her resilience, her refusal to give up on justice. And now that tree will bear fruit for generations to come," Mrs. Kimiko added. The three fell silent, watching the young people participating in the Foundation's programs. Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Korean Americans, all had rediscovered their identities and heritage through the work that had begun with a simple translation. "Do you know what amazes me the most?" Richard said. "What?" "How this story proves it's never too late to right a wrong. 300 years later, justice was served. And it proves that one person can change the world," Margaret added. "Mary Lee never stopped believing in justice, even as she died in poverty. And it proves the truth always finds a way to emerge," Mrs. Kimiko finished, "even when it seems buried forever." 5 years after the partnership with China, the Mary Lee Santos Foundation had become an international model for historical justice and cultural reconnection. Similar organizations were established in other countries with significant Chinese diaspora communities, all inspired by the pioneering work that had begun in Los Angeles. Margaret, now 70, remained executive director, but had created a succession program to ensure the Foundation's mission would continue. Young Chinese American leaders were being trained to take on roles of responsibility, bringing fresh perspectives and energy. Richard, at 85, had become a respected figure in the American academic community. His research on United States-China trade relations during the colonial period had resulted in 3 published books and several international conferences. "Who would have thought," he remarked to Margaret during one of his visits to the Foundation, "that I'd become an academic in my old age?" "You've always been intelligent," Margaret replied. "You just needed to direct that intelligence towards something constructive." Mrs. Kimiko had passed away peacefully at 95, surrounded by the extended family the Foundation had become for her. In her will, she left the jade pendant to the Foundation with the condition that it be passed to each new executive director as a symbol of continuity. "May Mary Lee's pendant continue to guide those who fight for justice," she had written in her final letter. On the Foundation's 15th anniversary, Margaret organized a special event to celebrate all that had been achieved. Over 1,000 people attended, including Foundation beneficiaries, donors, international partners, and government officials. During the event, impressive data was presented. More than 500 Chinese American families had rediscovered their roots. 137 financial reparations had been completed. 63 cultural programs were operating across the United States. And 21 Chinese universities offered special scholarships for Chinese American descendants. "But the statistics don't tell the full story," Margaret said in her keynote speech. "Each number represents transformed lives, reclaimed identities, restored justice." She gestured to the audience. "You are living proof that historical injustices can be corrected, no matter how old they are." Richard Warren Montgomery was invited to give the evening's closing remarks. When he took the stage, he received a spontaneous ovation that visibly moved him. 15 years ago, he said, his voice steady despite his advanced age, "I committed an act of cruelty that changed my life forever. I offered my inheritance to a janitor in exchange for a translation, believing I was humiliating her. Today I understand that Margaret didn't just accept my challenge. She gave me a far greater inheritance than any sum of money, the legacy of redemption, justice, and purpose." He looked directly at Margaret. "Margaret, you translated more than an ancient Mandarin document. You translated a life of selfishness into a life of service, ill-gotten wealth into an instrument of justice, a family marked by cruelty into one defined by compassion. And most importantly," he continued, "you proved it's never too late to acknowledge our mistakes and dedicate the rest of our lives to making them right." The audience rose in a standing ovation that lasted 10 minutes. Many were in tears, including Margaret. When the applause finally subsided, Margaret stepped onto the stage and embraced Richard. "Thank you," she whispered, "for having the courage to change." "Thank you," he replied, "for teaching me change was possible." After the event, Margaret and Richard walked through the Foundation's garden, reflecting on the extraordinary journey they had shared. "Margaret," Richard said, "may I confess something?" "Of course." "Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I'd never offered that challenge, if I'd simply kept treating you like an invisible janitor." Margaret stopped walking and looked at him. "I wonder that too. And you know what conclusion I always reach?" "What?" "That somehow, some way the truth would have emerged. Maybe not in the same way, maybe not through us, but justice has a force of its own that can't be suppressed forever." "Do you really believe that?" "I do. Li Wei sent Mary Lee to the United States 350 years ago. She carried that seed of justice throughout her life and passed it on to her descendants. The seed lay dormant for generations, but it was there, waiting for the right moment to sprout." Richard Warren Montgomery nodded slowly. "And we were just the gardeners who happened to be in the right place at the right time." "Exactly. With the difference that you had the choice between being a gardener or a destroyer of seeds. And you chose to be a gardener." "Not immediately," Richard recalled. "My first reaction was to try and destroy the seed, but you changed your mind, and that change made all the difference." They continued walking in silence, observing the trees Mrs. Kimiko had planted in the garden, each representing a family that had rediscovered their roots through the Foundation. "Margaret," Richard finally said, "do you think we've fulfilled our mission?" "I think we've created something greater than ourselves," she replied. "The Foundation now has a life of its own, independent of any of us, and that's exactly how it should be. As Mrs. Kimiko always said, the best trees are those that grow beyond the shadow of those who planted them, and our tree has certainly grown beyond our shadow." 2 years later, Margaret announced her retirement as executive director of the Foundation. At 72, she felt it was time to pass the torch to the next generation of leaders. The chosen successor was Lucy Zhang Santos, a 35-year-old Chinese-American lawyer who had been one of the first beneficiaries of the Foundation's programs. Lucy had discovered her Chinese heritage through the Foundation's genealogical work and had later dedicated herself to studying international law with a focus on historical justice. "I couldn't imagine a better successor," Margaret said during the transition ceremony. "Lucy embodies everything our Foundation stands for: the union between tradition and innovation, between the United States and China, between the past we honor and the future we build." Richard, now 87 and in fragile health, also announced he would step back from his activities at the Foundation, but would remain as an honorary advisor. "My journey on this earth is nearing its end," he said serenely. "But the journey of justice we helped begin is just starting." On the eve of her official retirement, Margaret received an unexpected visit. It was Edward Smith, her ex-husband, now 78, and clearly worn down by age and illness. "Margaret," he said, lowering himself with difficulty into the chair across from her desk, "I came to say goodbye." "Goodbye?" "The doctors gave me little time. Pancreatic cancer, advanced stage." Margaret felt a mix of conflicting emotions: anger for the past, sadness for his condition, and surprisingly compassion. "I'm sorry, Edward. I wanted to thank you," he said weakly. "You could have destroyed me when you had the chance. You could have exposed me publicly, ruined my reputation. Why would I do that? Because I deserved it. For what I did to you, to our life, to your career." Margaret leaned forward. "Edward, I forgave you long ago, not for you, but for me. Holding on to resentment is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. You're an extraordinary woman, Margaret. Always were. I was just too small to see it. You've changed too, Edward. In the donations you've made to the Foundation, I saw a person completely different from the one I knew." Edward smiled sadly. "Your Foundation gave me the chance to repair at least a small part of the harm I caused. It's more than I deserved." "Everyone deserves a chance at redemption," Margaret said. "You, Richard, even me. We all have shadows in our past. The difference is, you had the courage to face your shadows and turn them into light." Edward rose with difficulty. "I want you to know I'll die in peace, knowing you not only overcame what I did, but used that experience to help hundreds of others." "Edward," said Margaret, also standing, "forgiveness isn't just a word, it's an action. I forgive you completely." They embraced for the first time in 20 years. When Edward left the office, Margaret knew she'd likely never see him again. He passed away 3 weeks later at peace, after donating all his remaining assets to the foundation. On the day of her official retirement, Margaret organized a small ceremony in the foundation's garden. Only close people were invited: Richard Warren, David and his family, Lucy Zhang Santos, and a few long-time foundation staff members. "When I first arrived here," Margaret said during her farewell speech, "I was a broken, humiliated woman who had lost faith in justice. Today I retire as someone who has seen justice triumph in ways I never imagined possible." She looked at Richard Warren, seated in the front row. "Richard Warren, thank you for that moment of cruelty that changed our lives forever. Without it, none of this would have happened." "Thank you," he replied, voice thick with emotion, "for turning my cruelty into compassion." Margaret turned to Lucy Zhang Santos. "Lucy, you're inheriting more than an organization. You're inheriting a mission, a purpose, a responsibility to justice that transcends any one of us." "I'll do my best to honor that legacy," Lucy replied. "And always remember," Margaret added, "the true measure of our success isn't in what we accumulate, but in what we manage to give back to the world." After the ceremony, Margaret and Richard Warren sat together in the garden, watching the sunset through the trees Mrs. Kimiko had planted. "Margaret," Richard Warren said, "do you regret anything?" "What could I regret?" "Losing 15 years of your life as a janitor, being humiliated, mistreated, underestimated." Margaret thought for a long moment. "You know, Richard Warren, for a long time I did regret it. I felt anger, bitterness, self-pity, but now I understand those 15 years weren't lost. They were preparation." "Preparation for what?" "For this moment, for this mission, for the chance to turn personal suffering into collective healing." She gestured toward the foundation building. "If I hadn't gone through that humiliation, I'd never have had the empathy to understand others' pain. If I hadn't lost everything, I'd never have known the value of the second chances we were offering people." "So you believe everything happened as it should?" "I believe everything happened as it needed to. Life isn't fair, Richard Warren, but we can make it fairer through our choices and actions." Richard Warren nodded, watching the last daylight reflect on the foundation's windows. "Margaret, can I confess something?" "Always." "You were the best teacher I ever had. You taught me more about life, justice, and humanity than all the books I've read. And you were the best student. You proved it's never too late to learn how to be a better person." When night had fully fallen, Margaret and Richard Warren still sat in the garden, two survivors of their own redemption journeys, forever united by the shared experience of turning injustice into a force for good. "You know what amazes me most about this whole story?" Margaret said. "What?" "How one moment of cruelty became a lifetime of compassion. How a 300-year-old document connected people who didn't even know each other. How a janitor and a billionaire became partners fighting for justice. And how a simple translation became a revolution," Richard Warren added. "Not just a language translation," corrected Margaret. "A translation of the soul. From hatred to love, from separation to connection, from despair to hope." "The most important translation we've ever done," agreed Richard Warren Montgomery. They fell silent, watching the stars begin to appear in the Los Angeles sky. Somewhere in the universe, the souls of Li Wei, Mary Lee, and Mrs. Kimiko were finally at peace, knowing justice had triumphed, even if it had taken 350 years. And in the offices of the Mary Lee Santos Foundation, Lucy Zhang Santos worked late into the night, planning the next chapters of a story that had begun with a translation and become an endless mission. The legacy had finally been returned. Not just the money, but something far more valuable. Dignity, justice, and proof that love always conquers hatred. Truth always overcomes lies. And justice, even when delayed, always finds a way to prevail. The end. Now tell me what you thought of the story and where you're watching from. If you have anything to share with us, leave your honest thoughts in the comments. Do you believe Richard made the right decision? We'd love to hear your opinion. Thank you so much for joining us. Don't forget to like the video and, most importantly, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss other moving stories.